Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring you today's most pressing issues from across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korean prosecutors filed for an extension of the arrest warrant for President Yoon Suk Yeol on Friday as they seek to speed up the investigation into his short-lived martial law declaration. Now, this request, submitted to the Seoul Central District Court, could keep Yoon in detention until February 6th, pending approval. The move follows the transfer of the case from the Corruption Investigation Office for high-ranking officials to the prosecution, as the agency lacks the authority to indict a sitting president. With a potential in-person interrogation on the horizon, questions remain about President Yoon's cooperation and the implications of the unfolding legal battle. For more on this, we invite Cho Hee-kyung, professor of law at Hongik University, with us. Welcome, Professor.
Hello, good to be here.
And also joining us is Lee Hee-yeon, Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Great to have you, Professor.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
So, Professor Lee, today, prosecutors applied for an extension to keep President Yoon detained for a longer period of time. Could you explain for us the procedure of this? And is there a possibility that the court may deny the extension offer?
Right, as you were saying, that basically right now, the hearing for whether the extension of the warrant is happening right now. And so the procedure by which the prosecutors must seek a warrant or extension in this case is to go to the court to get that extension. Because normally when a suspect is being detained, right, the suspect, of course, has civil rights, and there has to be justification in order to go beyond the initial 10-day period, which the CIO, the Corruption Investigation Office, they originally got an arrest warrant and detention warrant against the president for the initial investigation by the CIO. And that was, of course, issued by the Seoul Western District Court. But in this case, because the case has now been transferred to the prosecutor's office, now the jurisdiction or the venue has changed to the Seoul Central District Court. And so in this case, if they want to go beyond the initial 10-day period, they have to get a 10-day extension. And that's where the prosecutors are arguing for the extension. Now, under the Criminal Procedure Act of Korea, there are two provisions which govern detention. And so that's Article 201 and Article 70 of the Criminal Procedure Act. And so the underlying basis for which you can detain someone, really in this case, the relevant portion is Article 70. In this case, it's whether or not the suspect is going to potentially destroy evidence. There's no indication, of course, that President Yoon will flee the country, given his profile. But as far as destruction of evidence, that's the main reason by which the prosecutors are seeking his detention. So in this case, that's what the judges are going to have to sort of figure out, and whether or not that's really going to happen or potentially going to happen. And that's the basis for which the extension is going to be given. So because the court originally gave an detention, I don't think there's any reason to believe that the court won't, in this case, decide to extend it. So I'd be very surprised if the court actually doesn't extend the detention period.
So it's highly likely to be extended. Now, then, if the court grants the extension, the expected end time of the detention period is going to be until the 6th of next month. In this case, President Yoon will be interrogated while still in detention. Professor Cho, if this scenario proceeds as planned, when could we possibly expect a trial verdict?
That's actually getting way ahead of ourselves because at the end of the detention period, the prosecution office has to decide whether they're going to indict the accused, in this case, Mr. Yoon, and on what charges. Now, obviously, the charge of insurrection is going to be a likely crime that he will be indicted with. But we don't know what other crimes that he might be charged with and what other, potential crimes that the prosecution has been investigating. I mean, there are, a handful just that immediately spring to mind, such as abuse of office, destruction of evidence, because while he was cooped up in his presidential residence in Hannam-dong, we have some reports that he actually ordered destruction of certain equipment and servers and erasing of records, etc., etc. And so I suspect the prosecution has been investigating those acts as well. There is also obviously conspiracy to, basically try to force people to testify in his favor, even to the extent of actually lying on oath, which we saw yesterday at the Constitutional Court. And various other charges, and not to mention military insurrection, which is also a potential charge that could be, levied against Yoon. And so, depending on what crimes will constitute the indictment, that will determine the length of the trial. Just by a reference, in Park Geun-hye's case, the initial trial actually took close to a year until the verdict came down after she was actually indicted. And I suspect that Yoon will use every trick in the book to try to delay the criminal proceedings as well. And so it might be even longer than a year.
Mm-hmm. So this latest development came as the Corruption Investigation Office for high-ranking officials has sent this case to the prosecution and requested for an indictment. Professor Lee, what do you think is the reason behind their early transmission decision to the prosecution?
Right. So the CIO was essentially getting nowhere with President Yoon since he was not being cooperative. When the CIO eventually got to investigate and actually question President Yoon, they initially had him for about over 10 hours. But essentially, he refused to give any responses, any statements to them. And basically, his argument was, and also through him personally, but also through his lawyers, that basically the CIO was, beyond its jurisdiction in terms of questioning the president for the specific crime of insurrection and treason, because the CIO itself doesn't have the authority to investigate technically that crime, as well as, or for that matter, bring an indictment. So he was trying to use that basis to sort of argue that the CIO, since it lacked jurisdiction over him to investigate, that he was justified by refusing essentially to answer questions. And by the way, that's of course the right of any criminal suspect, that you have the right to remain silent. And so what he did essentially was to exercise that right with respect to the CIO. And so CIO itself, because it was really getting nowhere with President Yoon, decided essentially to cut its losses and then shift him over to the prosecutor. And the idea here is that because the prosecutor presumably has the power to indict, and then to actually bring the formal criminal trial to start, that the CIO had no interest to sort of maintain its position vis-a-vis Yoon in this case, and to then send them over. But I think this is really kind of puts the CIO at a sort of a crossroads at some level, because the CIO has had some difficulty in the past by trying to deal with people who are high-ranking officials and not really being able to follow through its investigations. And so I suspect that because of this, there'll have to be some reform of the CIO if this is going to be a viable investigative body. But in any event, the CIO really had nothing to do more, and so therefore it sent the case over to the prosecutors to have better luck on President Yoon.
Right. So despite the risks about its existence, they proceeded with sending it to the prosecution. Then, Professor Cho, we are aware that President Yoon has continually refused to cooperate with the CIO. Do you think he would comply with the prosecution's investigation this time around?
He will certainly meet with them at least once. Now, I understand that even ordinarily, Yoon used to make very denigrating remarks about CIO. Now, Yoon is nothing if not an elitist, and he used to refer to CIO as a third-rate agency. And so not only was CIO's investigation in his eyes illegal, but he essentially didn't want to stoop down to having to answer questions from what he considered to be a third-rate agency, whereas Prosecution Office is basically home, where he spent his entire career almost. and he probably will expect more favorable treatment, although whether prosecution office will give him that, I'm not sure. But he will certainly make them probably come and visit him at the detention center rather than deigning to actually turn himself up for questioning at the prosecution office. And so it basically, playing the power game right until the end. But just in relation to CIO, I do want to mention that CIO was an agency that was really half-baked from the very beginning. And that was because the reforms that were attempted of the prosecution office under Moon administration were at every turn blocked by the then opposition, now the ruling party, the Conservative Party. And so given that CIO has, limited number of personnel, they've got 60 officers altogether, as opposed to 3,000 at the prosecution office. The prosecution office also has some 4,000 investigation officers. So if you are looking at the actual capacity of the offices, you just can't compare the two agencies.
Right. So since Yoon has been, not really acknowledging the CIO, his side has issued a stern warning saying that we will hold the CIO legally accountable for its unlawful investigation and illegal actions. Professor, what does the legal responsibility mentioned by President Yoon's side imply?
It really doesn't bear any real proper analysis. It's just bluffing on Yoon's part. And it's been confirmed by the court numerous times that what CIO was doing in terms of investigation and issuing of arrest warrant and detention warrant was completely legal. And so I don't really think they have any justified legal ground to argue that what CIO was doing was illegal. I think it's really for the purposes of, once again, gathering support from Yoon's diehard supporters, basically.
Right, so more of a political motive. Now let's move on to the fourth trial session that was held on Thursday. The first witness, former Minister of Defense Kim Mok-yeon's face-to-face encounter with President Yoon has garnered a lot of attention, but there was no partition between the two sides. Professor Cho, how would you generally assess the testimonies made yesterday? How did you see it?
Well, the term testimonies is an interesting one because to me, it seemed like they were mostly perjuries rather than testimonies. I mean, seriously, the partition was requested initially because there was concern that the witness, Kim Mok-yeon, the former defense minister, might be under pressure from Yoon, who was his former boss, to essentially perjure himself and give testimonies that are favorable to Yoon, even though they may not be true. But they didn't really have to. that was needless worry, because obviously the two had somehow communicated with each other and decided to tell a very nice fairy tale to the Constitutional Court judges. But I think they really selected their audience very badly, because the judges asked very sharp, very pointed questions that just laid bare how implausible and incredible the testimony that Kim Jong-un was giving, to try to somehow take all the blame for himself and to claim that, Yoon was really not at fault in this whole illegal martial law declaration that he'd made.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to touch upon the minister's remarks as we discussed, but I want to ask Professor Lee too, what were your takeaways from yesterday's session?
Well, I thought the whole situation with the president being in the same room with the Minister of Defense at the Constitutional Court to be, extraordinary. I mean, given the seriousness and the gravity of the whole event itself, I think as a trial, just being a lawyer myself and being in the circumstances of being in a trial, but having the highest political officers to be in a courtroom of that nature, and then having to take questions from the judges themselves, and of course, I mean, extraordinarily too, with President Yoon even asking questions and delivering remarks. So I mean, just the biggest takeaway for me was just again this extraordinary nature of the situation and the venue. But I mean, essentially, one thing I was thinking about as I was sort of listening to the testimony and reviewing what was said is what were the judges, and I think President Joe sort of touched on this a little bit in terms of how the judges would perceive the credibility of the witnesses and the veracity of the testimony, because when you look at sort of what's being said in court and in testimony that's being given, you're going to think about, is this person believable? And given the circumstances and the way that's being spun, from various places, obviously whether you're on the President Yoon side of things or sort of you're on the other side in terms of the National Assembly. The real issue is credibility, and so the question, I guess, is really, I think, being played out here is what being said really something that is believable or not? And it's not just the testimony of force itself from the individuals like the Minister of Defense, right? And President Yoon, I imagine, at some point will give his own testimony, but there's documentary evidence, there's evidence that's being presented on different levels, the soldiers that were involved, the commanders, so all that will be sort of brought together, right, by the court itself to then make a decision. But I just, the biggest takeaway for me was just the extraordinary nature of the whole event itself by having these people sitting in a trial of this nature at the highest levels.
Right, of course, Kim would be definitely pressured a lot with the situation there. But mentioning about the credibility of the witness, a battle of truth between President Yoon and former Minister Kim was kind of expected to unfold. But during the witness testimony, former Minister Kim accepted the claims of President Yoon's side and kind of took sole responsibility for the state of emergency. So based on his statement, could we understand that he personally wrote the proclamation and that President Yoon did not thoroughly review it? And could this be interpreted as what he essentially was planning and executing the state of emergency himself?
Well, I mean, he's clearly falling on his own sword here. And that's sort of the question, is whether that, again, is believable or not, because the thought that he drafted the declaration and the promulgation itself for the martial law order, and the president really didn't take the time as he normally would to review such a document seems quite implausible, given the severity of what they were trying to do. And martial law, of course, is one of the most serious acts that you can undertake if you're the president, and not having the president himself not reviewing the document in detail before then executing the whole martial law decree is, at some level, kind of, unbelievable. But I mean, when we talk about this whole circumstance, and we have to remember that what the court is trying to decide here is not. I mean, there's some technical legal issues that are being raised here, and the court has sort of identified, certain areas where they're going to be investigating, and presumably, if the severity of what's found in terms of whether or not, for example, if there's obstruction, or whether the announcement itself was, impermissible under a Korean law, or searching and seizing the election commission, for instance, by using the military, whether that was improper or an abuse of authority. I mean, really, despite this particular claim by the Minister of Defense for sort of instituting, promulgating the the martial law order decree, is just one small among many kinds of accusations that are being made, which the court has to evaluate. And so if the court deems that the severity of the violations of anything that's being accused of by the president, despite the minister's, accepting of responsibility for what happened, the court then can proceed to then impeach the president. So what I take from this is, again, you have to sort of, I guess, take it with a grain of salt in terms of the minister himself, whether, again, he's believable. But then, following through, the president has to make the decision. And ultimately, the buck stops with the president, right? He's the highest executive officer. And whatever the ministers advise him to do, they only give him advice, right? They propose, but the president has to decide. And ultimately, he's the one that's responsible. So in this case, if the court deems him to be, of course, ultimately responsible for the actual martial law declaration and the subsequent events that occurred afterwards, and whether or not he, in fact, then ordered troops to do certain things, then I think we're going to look at the real possibility for impeachment here by the judges. So I think that's what we're going to have to be looking forward to in terms of beyond just the minister's statement himself, because this is just at the beginning of the testimony. A lot more, of course, will be borne out in the course of the testimony, as well as the presentation of evidence. So we're just really at the early stages here, and we'll have to wait and see in terms of what more comes out in terms of this particular trial.
Right. So we have a lot of questions about the credibility and the court's decision. But at this point, we must be curious. Ben, what is it for former Defense Minister Kim? He has been consistently defending President Yoon, and even while in detention. And he also did that again during his testimony yesterday. Professor Cho, why do you think this is the case? Is this kind of a legal tactic, or how do you read behind this?
Well, initially, we all thought that former defense minister was really doing his utmost to try to defend Yoon to the end. But having heard his testimony from yesterday, and also its effect on the justices on the Constitutional Court, one has to wonder whether Kim is really trying to defend Yoon, because I think Kim's really, nudged at least the two conservative justices that people were concerned would be voting against impeaching Yoon that much closer to actually voting for, because those two, Jung Hyung-sik and Kim Hyung-do, two, dyed-in-the-wool conservative justices, were asking some of the most pointed questions at Kim yesterday. And the thing was, Kim was contradicting himself while giving testimony before the Constitutional Court. And he also contradicted the previous evidence that he had given while he was being questioned by the prosecution office. Now, Acting Chief Justice Jeon Hyung-bae asked Kim two questions, one of which was, do you confirm that you actually testified at the prosecution office and verify the statements that you had given to the prosecution office? And Kim confirmed, yes, I did. He even confirmed that, yes, his lawyer was present and he read and signed the statements that he had made to the prosecution office. Now, the statements that he had given to the prosecution office basically contradicts almost 99% of the testimony that he actually gave before the Constitutional Court. And what he also did was Yoon's team basically objected to having the martial law decree number 1 admitted into evidence. But because he consistently referred to the decree, the justice actually said, well, we're going to accept it as evidence. And that particular decree plus Yoon's statements basically go to prove that he was acting completely unconstitutionally by making it illegal for the National Assembly to conduct any political activity. So he was really nailing the coffin of Yoon. And so whether he was really defending Yoon, that might have been his intention, because he sees his fate inextricably tied together with Yoon's, but the effect of it is the opposite.
Mm-hmm. So as we wait for the legal proceedings to unfold, it will be really crucial to see how this dynamic shapes both legal strategy and the political landscape moving forward. But for now, we'll have to leave our discussion here. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Lee and Professor Cho. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
That'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.